we might start at least the introductions. So this is obviously the seminar that was postponed last Thursday because our speaker, Roberto Castillo, wasn't well. And in fact, it's really nice of him to do it today. He is better, but not fully recovered. And as a precaution that his health might not have fully recovered, he's very thoughtfully recorded his talk. And he's going to actually present the recording of his talk, but he is here in person, as you can see. He's moving on the screen, and he will be here for the full, question and answers and discussion and so on. It's just that he thought it was better, in case he should have had a relapse, that he had a talk ready. So that's very thoughtful of you, Roberto. Thank you for doing that. And when we get to the discussion period, as we've done in the past, we will let everybody come onto the screen if they want to have their video on, but I'll ask you to just mute yourselves till I ask you to speak if you have a question, and you can indicate that you have a question just by raising your hand, showing me coming on the video, showing me your hand, or by saying in the chat function that you'd like to be able to present a question. So Dr. Roberto Castillo is an assistant professor at the Department of Cultural Studies at Lingnan University in Hong Kong. His academic training is in cultural studies, international relations, history, and journalism. He's been researching African presence in China since 2010. His research interests are transnationality, migration and mobility, the critique of nationalism and globalization, China's changing ethnoscapes with a focus on foreign presence in the country, Africa-China relations, the cultural politics of media representation, of race, ethnicity, critical theory, and Chinese politics. And he administers a website to do with China and Africa, which he'll talk about and present in a moment. So I think we're ready to hand over to you. I'll just remind people the title of your talk today, Roberto. It's Race and Racism in Contemporary Africa-China Relations Research, Approaches, Controversies and Reflections. So thank you so much for joining us today, and over to you, Roberto.
Thank you very much, Professor Mudud. This is my pleasure to be here with you today. So I would also like to thank to anybody else who's involved from the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship. It's really a pleasure. And again, as you were mentioning a minute ago, I think I'm fine. But anyway, I just recorded, today I recorded the talk that I want to have with you. Throughout the day, I've been recording it at different points, and I just put everything together for you. And let me just start sharing my screen before I keep talking. Here we go. Okay, so you should be able to see let me just pin myself here. And yeah, now you should be able to see the website that Professor Mudud was talking about.
Yes,
just very quickly, for the last 10 years, I've been administering this website, which started like a blog and then became something a little bit more relevant. It's africansinchina.net, and you can just go later. It's got like 500 posts of so many different aspects of African presence in China mostly. And yeah, so it works as a repository in many ways of many of the really relevant things that are associated with Africans in China. So for those of you who are interested in the topic, you can go there. And the other thing I wanted to share with you before I start my my talk today is just quickly, I am a young scholar, not that young anymore, but I've been getting a little bit old here in Hong Kong. I've been living for a long time in China now, but I just came up with this book this year, African Transnational Mobility in China, Africans on the Move. And some of the things I talk about today, not much, but some of the things that I'm going to be talking about are in this book, but I mostly talk about mobility as a form of movement between Africa and China in this book. And I think that maybe some of you could enjoy it if you're interested. And maybe Professor Mudud, if he is interested, he could order this book to have it in the library at your center or your university. Having done these little blogs, commercials, promotions, I'm just gonna quickly, I think that you should be able to listen to some music in the background. Is that okay? Can you hear that music? It's very mild. Doesn't matter if you cannot hear it. All right, so I'm just gonna start sharing my talk, and yeah, I'll be here, and then I'll see you in 50 minutes for the Q&A, 50. So some years ago, during a lecture I was giving on media representation, race and racism in Africa-China relations in a Hong Kong university, a student from Nigeria raised her hand and made a remark that blew my mind and left me thinking, quote, "You cannot compare the history of racism against the Chinese to the history of racism against black people. In terms of racism, only blacks can speak. In fact, when it comes to Chinese in Africa, they are as racist as Europeans are." End of quote. The student was one of the most brilliant students that I have ever taught, a great conversationalist with ample international experience across Africa and the West. After a brief discussion, during which other African and Chinese students intervened, we managed to agree as a class on the point that the histories of racism, racialization, and racial prejudice are the outcome of complex, historic, transnational, and global processes, and that these processes are not exclusive to one group or geographical region, and perhaps more importantly, that they cannot be written within one single history of racism. The Nigerian student, however, remained hesitant and not fully convinced. Ever since I started researching and teaching Africa-China relations in 2011, I have been in countless discussions where questions about race and racism in contemporary engagements between Africans and Chinese have emerged. This is a common experience for researchers of Africa-China relations. For instance, historian Jamie Monson notes that the audiences at her talks focus more on race than the historical sources that she has found. In my experience, questions related to race and racism are more likely to come from Western audiences or journalists, or from non-Western students and scholars in Western academic environments. Indeed, Western audiences often racialize conversations about Africa and China. When I find myself in the midst of these conversations, I normally start by explaining that while Africans and Chinese both have a racial consciousness and that there are some racial tensions, these do not characterize Africa-China relations. I often argue that as the contact increases, it is evident that there is a significant amount of ignorance about the racial histories of the other, as shown by my Nigerian students' remarks. Now, for the last decade, there has been a scholarly and media fascination with Afro-Chinese engagements. Academic literature in the field of Africa-China relations has increased exponentially, and a simple online search for Africa-China related topics yields innumerable media results. The fascination with this renewed engagement is in no way exclusive to the West. In her book, Mapping the New African Diaspora in China, Race and the Cultural Politics of Belonging, Shanshan Lan recounts how the educated classes that are part of her social circles in China are fascinated with the African presence in the country, and how they form their opinions and racial knowledge about Africans mainly through the internet. Recent online research in China suggests that social media and the internet are indeed critical vehicles for the dissemination of racial and national identity formation discourses. Within these discourses, the notion of race may be more important than previously thought. In fact, stories discussing racial issues are among the most popular and commented stories on Chinese social media and internet fora. Now, over the last 5 years, as Africa-China relations have moved beyond the honeymoon period and into a more complex stage, a number of incidents have exploded into global controversies about race, racism, and racial hierarchies. Given this context, research on race and racism, and here I always use quotation marks on race and racism, in Africa-China relations has been scarce and fraught with methodological issues and challenges. So in this article and in this project, I first provide, in this presentation today, I first provide a critical analysis on the ways in which the existing body of Africa-China relations knowledge engages with the analytical categories of race and racism. After that, following Monson and Lan, who have both argued for the need of a triangulation to better understand racialization processes in the relationship, I introduced the notion of multiple triangulations to both analyze these processes and to distance the discussion from Euro-American binaries and dichotomies around race and racism. This is followed by a brief discussion on one of the most recent controversies relating to race and racism in Afro-Chinese mediascapes. Towards the end of this presentation, I reflect on the most common methodological issues and challenges in the research on Afro-Chinese encounters. Finally, I discuss the need to develop a global post-imperial vocabulary of race and racism and indicate what may be the early steps towards doing so. Before proceeding, it is important to note that discussions about race and racism and about the nature of the power and racial hierarchies emerging from Afro-Chinese engagements are highly contentious and multi-perspectival. They extend from intimate and individual experiences to digitally mediated transnational interactions to global representations and discourses. An overarching characteristic of the discussions around the controversial incident that I present here today, however, is the lack of a space for contextualization or a deeper understanding, which undoubtedly include a critical reflection on the meanings associated with race and racism in the diverse and evolving African and Chinese contexts. What usually happens is that the debates around these issues get quickly colonized by the hegemonic power of Euro-American cultural imperialism and its binary discourse of race and racism. A few cautionary notes are in order. First and foremost, here I do not aim to answer the questions such as, are the Chinese in Africa racist, or is China a racist society, or is there racism against Chinese in Africa? Rather, I aim to provide a critical take on how are the notions of race and racism articulated in literature and media, and I put forward a conceptual formulation that attempts to expand theorizations on Africa-China race-related research. It is important to note that the more recent literature engaging with the notions of race and racism in Africa-China relations, the literature that I pay more attention in this research, often set out the following historical stages as a basis for their argumentation. First one is China's pre-modern encounters with blackness. The second one is the arrival of the notion of race and its signification or becoming Chinese. Number three, the racial thinking under internationalism. And number four, post-socialist configurations of racial thinking. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip these historical landmarks or stages, and I'm going to focus on more contemporary research, but I could come back to any of these topics in the Q&A. Rather than reviewing each source individually here, I have identified four main themes that recur or pervade more contemporary scholarly production and discussions around race and racism in Africa-China relations. The themes are as follow. The first one is the discourse of institutional racism against blacks in China. The second one is research into online constructions of blackness in the era of racial nationalism. The third one is demythologizing Chinese racism in Africa whilst de-racializing anti-Chinese sentiment. And the need to think in, and the last one is the need to think in terms of processes of racialization rather than in terms of racism. So these are four main themes that I just mentioned and that I'm going to be addressing consecutively in the next following minutes. So the first one is the discourse of institutional racism against blacks in China. For the last 2 decades, Guangdong province has been at the forefront of African presence in China. Cities in the Pearl River Delta like Guangzhou, Foshan, Zhuhai, Shenzhen, among many others, have seen their foreign population management systems tested by the increase of foreign presence. The management or lack of management capabilities in these cities has sometimes resulted in tensions between local, provincial, national and foreign policy makers. These policy changes have been widely felt by diverse foreign communities in the region, but the most widespread implication of these changes is that visa renewal has become increasingly difficult. And don't even talk about what has been happening right now with the pandemic, right? So remember, all this is pre-pandemics. The increased presence of Africans has been construed by some scholars as the trigger for certain local policy changes in foreign population management. Legal loopholes and lack of proper enforcement in foreign population management have also resulted in abuses of authority at the local level in Guangzhou. These abuses are epitomized by the emergence of a cat-mouse game economy, in which instances of racial profiling and persecution, with a particular focus on black and brown bodies, are pervasive. Now, scholarship, nonetheless, has mostly focused on black bodies, not so much on brown bodies. The difficulties that foreigners in southern China face in regards to their migratory status, along with the impact of popular narratives in global media about Africans struggling in China, have led some scholars and journalists to claim that there is a type of anti-African sentiment structuring local legal and policy transformations. Land, for instance, suggests that the Guangdong level anti-African campaign, that's what she calls it, anti-African campaign, may be the starting point for a nationwide anti-immigrant legislation. Now, the existence and implementation of an anti-African campaign in China is debatable. However, what matters here is that race and racism have been conceptually mobilized to structure a discourse of the institutionalization of anti-black racism in China. This discourse points to the, quote, the legal construction of illegality, end of quote, and its conflation with blackness as exhibit A, if you will, in an early stage of the development of what Shan Shanlan calls institutional racism. Now, while it is crucial to look into issues of law and policy to make sense of how race and racism crisscross regimes of mobility and the experiences of individuals, introducing a heavily loaded concept such as institutional racism is at the very least risky, if not far from accurate. In the United States, for instance, institutional racism makes black men 3 times more likely to be killed by police than any other ethnic group. In the United Kingdom, institutionalized surveillance of black and brown bodies makes them 40 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white bodies. These are just a few examples in the seemingly interminable history of violent exclusions machinated through complex historical processes of classification, categorization, and management of otherness that have been produced by colonialism and post-colonialism. Depending on the context, these exclusions are variously and often interchangeably referred to as institutional, systemic, or structural racisms. Now, to claim that such a thing as institutional racism exists or maybe emerging in China in relation to black people is to equate decisions regarding local population management, decisions that are not traceable to any nationwide policy and that may or may not be connected to forms of racial thinking and prejudice, to the complex historical processes of institutionalization of race and racism that have taken place elsewhere. Now, somehow, the discourse of institutional racism in China is akin to that of Chinese colonialism in Africa, not only in that it is profoundly attractive to Western audiences. The portrayal of China as a racist society seems somehow to palliate white guilt, but more importantly, in that it often obscures and or negates the specificity of the violences involved in institutional racism in the American British contexts and in the European colonial and imperial projects in general. Now, moving forward to a second point that I want to highlight here, which is the online constructions of blackness in the era of racial nationalism. So the internet and other digital communication technologies have been analyzed as discursive sites for the articulations of and contestations over race and racism and nationalism in contemporary China. Existing literature on Africa-China relations focusing on race and racism highlights the convergence of constructions of blackness and Chinese national identity in the online realm. Now, focusing on racial hierarchies and racial threats, or the process of othering of Africans, tracing and reconstructing the online image of Africa in Chinese cyberspace, Simon Shen notes that the online circulation of ideas is plagued with misconceptions about Africa. Most of these misconceptions are associated to stereotypes about black peoples that can be traced back to China's pre-modern encounters with blackness, but also to contemporary ideas circulating on the web. Shen and Cheng both report that Chinese netizens mostly imagine Africans as inferior partners in business and politics, and mindless supporters of China who are generally poor, lazy, diseased, hypersexual, and ultimately threatening. According to these scholars, these perceptions of blackness are crucial elements in the prevailing Chinese discourse of black racial inferiority. Interestingly, many of the stereotypes that are used to construct blackness on the Chinese internet mirror American ones. Indeed, Lan Shanshan suggests or argues that the articulation of what she interchangeably calls the African black threat discourse among Chinese netizens is based upon a transnational circulation of racial knowledge that manifests in frequent citations of literature, anecdotes, and historical incidents originating in the United States and Europe. Now, Lan's findings highlight how the lack of interaction with Chinese netizens the lack of interaction that Chinese netizens have with Africans, and the non-existence of an anti-racist education in China, and the prominence of Western racial ideologies are major factors still shaping popular Chinese perceptions of blacks on the internet. Generally, however, contemporary research regarding online constructions of identity in China report that there is an overriding perception that Africans and blacks are not only economically and culturally inferior, but also a threat to the racial purity of the Chinese nation. Cheng warns that while the dichotomy of inferiority and superiority pervades the history of Chinese encounters with otherness, contemporary digital communication technologies allow for the articulation of discourses of difference into a racist rhetoric. While deeply rooted in Chinese ethnocentrism, this racist rhetoric has developed along the lines of discourses such as social Darwinism and colonial, post-colonial racial hierarchies, and may be in the process of consolidating with the articulation of racist, right-wing, populist, nativist discourses among Chinese nationalists. Indeed, It is in the process of the reconstruction of Chinese identity online and in the context of the rise of the country that both scholars, Shen and Cheng, signal to the othering of Africans as a common discursive practice. This practice is exemplified by instances of Chinese netizens using stereotypes about Africa and Africans to depict the continent as backward, deviant, and pathological compared to China, which is seen as racially pure and modern. Cheng notes that a systematic discourse of race has developed in much more articulate, sophisticated, and explicit ways in education and pop culture to accommodate contemporary Chinese nationalism. Also, Lan points out that the spread of this discourse may be fueled by the state's denial of the existence of racism in China and by the anonymous nature of the internet. Right? Now, research on the intersections between racial constructions, technology, and politics is scarce, not only in the context of China in general, but in Africa-China relations. As such, few sources point to the political function of online racist discourses in the context of tightly controlled public spheres in China. Different researchers have highlighted that racist rhetorics in contemporary Chinese digital spaces are inflamed by the intensity of political and socioeconomic contradictions and conflicts and used to vent frustration and anger. Pfaffman et al., for instance, argue that rather than being simply racist, anti-African rhetoric online functions as a tool for political critique. Yes, they claim that this type of racial scapegoating is used as a form of resistance to the government and is not so visible in more ethnically diverse societies. Rather than simply exhibiting an abstract intellectual or cultural disposition against the African other, they claim that commentary against African men dating Chinese women, for instance, may indicate a dissatisfaction with the long-term effects of China's family planning policies, or complaining about the presence of black students with scholarships in Chinese universities may be a critique of the poor quality of education available to Chinese students outside the main urban centers. So Pfaffman et al. List a number of examples in which they claim a critique of government policy is disguised as critique of Africans. They note, however, that the quote, irony of legitimizing the scapegoating of Africans by adopting rhetoric influenced by foreign stereotypes reveals an interesting tension between globalization and nationalism. Now, the next point I want to highlight here before moving forward to my theoretical formulation is this notion of demythologizing Chinese racism in Africa while de-racializing anti-Chinese sentiment. This is a very interesting tension here. So Adams Bodomo, an Ghanaian scholar who was based in Hong Kong for many years, points out the existence of an asymmetry of power in certain areas of Africa-China relations. This asymmetry is a multi-layered phenomenon that manifests not only in trade or politics, as he suggests, but also in other areas such as media and scholarship. There is a significant asymmetry in the ways in which knowledge is produced about the racial encounter between Chinese and Africans in Africa in particular. Media and scholarly representations of race relations in the context of Chinese presence in Africa often assume that Chinese are the racializers and Africans are the racialized. In other words, Chinese are constructed as the active agents of racist discourses and practices, whereas Africans are imagined as the passive victim without agency. Hence, the literature here tends to be divided between those who use incidents of racism, any incident of racism, as evidence to bolster the argument that Chinese presence in Africa is primarily motivated by a racist neo-colonial drive. mostly Western scholars and journalists there. And on the other hand, those who try to bring nuance to the debate by presenting findings often based on surveys and statistical data to reject notions of a systemic, racially informed imbalance in the relationship. Here we have Hong Kong-based people like Barry Southman and Yen Hairong. So there is indeed a dearth of scholarship on the implications of long-standing and widespread racist rhetoric in Africa against Chinese and against their presence on the continent. Indeed, in the context of Africa-China relations, only a few scholars have paid attention to the political articulation of narratives such as anti-Chinese sentiment and the yellow peril. Again, here I'm highlighting the work of the same scholars, Southman, Hairong, Yen. The history of Chinese presence in Africa is long, diverse, and deeply entangled in the complex processes involved in colonial and post-colonial contexts. Interestingly, in contemporary Africa-China scholarship, regardless of the context in which they take place, anti-Chinese rhetoric that variously describes Chinese people as uncivilized, heathens, a threat to Africans, a moral plague, human rubbish, Ching Chongs, yellow savages, Chinks, Chinese piglets, and many more, are not commonly cited by scholars in the African context as part of a racist rhetoric or an African racism. Anti-Chinese rhetoric and attitudes in Africa are normally seen as non-African and emerging from a xenophobic Western media. As such, they're flattened into discourses of anti-cynicism or diluted in wider, more complex discourses such as xenophobia in Africa. As noted earlier, similar rhetoric is presented by scholars as Exhibit A of racism when discussing constructions of blackness in the Chinese context. It could be argued that the power asymmetry in Africa-China relations is the factor driving scholarly interest in the racist rhetoric of the powerful and the reluctance to engage in the rhetoric articulated by the weak. Racism, we have learned through Michel Foucault's Society Must Be Defended, is embedded with power and organized through knowledge. So we must look into the dynamics organized by those in power against those in positions of weakness. That is fair. However, a relevant question here is, in the context of Chinese presence in Africa, who is the powerful and who is the weak? And here again, Southman and Yen note that have argued that the complex relationship between Chinese and Africans cannot simply be characterized as one in which the Chinese are in a perpetual position of power. Quote, Chinese have a recent tenuous presence in Africa and lack political power, determinative influence, or cultural hegemony. They are not positioned to create a public discourse to inferiorize their African hosts. And finally, the last point I want to highlight in this section is this discussion between, or this tension between these notions, racialization as a process versus racism as an incident. So Jamie Monson, his American historian, suggests that racism is only one of many possible forms of racial thought. She argues that a focus on racism as incident rather than on racialization as a process may obscure the ways in which racial thinking informs historical constructions of identity both in Africa and China. Moreover, she encourages scholars of identity to think through the processes of racialization through which individuals, communities, and nations construct and deploy their discourses of sameness and difference. Looking at processes of racialization in Africa-China relations not only points to the need to historicize the ways in which racial identities have been constructed in post-colonial and post-colonial settings, but also, and perhaps more crucially, to understand these processes as contextual, situational, contingent, and inherently unstable. Now, following Monson's suggestion, a number of scholars have taken note of the importance of thinking in terms of racialization. In their analysis of discourses of racialization of labor in the context of Chinese enterprises in Africa, Barry Saltman and Yen Hairong note that rhetorical racialization is multidirectional. Africans are racialized by various Chinese actors, and Chinese are racialized by various African actors. Drawing on existing literature regarding processes of racialization in the West, these scholars conceptualize it as a practice that extends racial meaning to social practices or groups, designates groups to be subjected to unequal treatment, and socio-culturally constructs hierarchy. So remember, we're talking about racialization. In this sense, racialization of Chinese in Africa, for instance, emerges from issues such as pay and workplace safety, but also from Western and local political forces, quote, taking up the cudgels against the Chinese as a whole, end of quote. So these scholars, Southman and Yan, note that the existing theorizations on racialization of labor fail to account for the markedly different role race plays in Afro-Chinese encounters across the continent. Another scholarly effort to think in terms of processes of racialization as a category of analysis is made by Shanshan Lan, who claims racialization is a bidirectional and multi-layered process that is closely linked to knowledge, as in knowing about the world. Accordingly, she puts forward the notion of racial learning to describe the development and accumulation of knowledge about racial differences and racial hierarchies through daily life experiences in various transnational, local, institutional, and community settings. From her work among ordinary Chinese and Africans in southern China, she argues that grassroots level encounters facilitate alternative sources of racial learning that have the potential to subvert hegemonic discourses such as that of race and white supremacy, but also Sino-African friendship. Now, through her work, Lan points to multiple ways in which blackness is racialized in China. Some of them were addressed earlier in this presentation. However, she comments that one of the best ways to understand Chinese processes of racialization is by focusing on the concept of suzhi. Suzhi is a difficult concept to translate. Literally, it is often translated as quality, but the conceptual meaning blurs the nature-nurture divide by encompassing three aspects of individual quality: the physical, the educational, and the moral. As noted by Lan, when the term is used to describe different groups of foreigners, the emphasis falls on attributes such as educational level, honesty, discipline, industriousness, and skill, rather than on biological differences. While Chinese media narratives such as the African threat tend to racialize blacks in China as criminals and therefore as being low suzhi foreigners, Lan illustrates how in interpersonal encounters, blacks can also be regarded as high suzhi due to their English language skills, religious piety, entrepreneurial skills, and honesty. Now, by looking at the intersection of suzhi and race as part of a process of racialization, Lan's work sheds light on how, in the Chinese context, personal virtues and social appropriate behaviors can sometimes outweigh skin color and other markers of racial difference. So what is clear from the works that I have reviewed is that racialized identities have been a historically significant element in Africa-China relations. These racialized identities are, quote, expressed and experienced in shifting and inconsistent ways across both time and place, as Monson has noted. In other words, it is not the same to be a Chinese in South Africa during the apartheid as it is now, nor is it the same to be a black person in 1960s Shanghai or in Shanghai today. Contexts matter, and to think that there is one single ahistorical way of perceiving or thinking about blackness in China or Chineseness in Africa is utterly inaccurate. However, as many scholars researching Afro-Chinese interpersonal relations have witnessed, encounters in everyday life settings often involve mutual stereotypes and racialized expectations. When mutual stereotypes are deployed, the ethnic and cultural diversity amongst both Africans and Chinese lack a strong currency. All blacks in China are African, and all Chinese Asians in Africa are the same, despite markers of ethnic or other identity differences. Racializing stereotypes thrive in these types of simplifications. Now, during my fieldwork in Guangzhou some years ago, I spoke to countless newly arrived African traders who made remarks such as, quote, Chinese in the mainland are uncivilized, unlike those in Hong Kong, end of quote. Chinese traders, on the other hand, often described Africans as being 不文明的, or uncivilized, or as coming from 不文明的国家, or coming from uncivilized countries, right? In both directions, the apparent lack of civility was mobilized in multiple ways, as a failure to be modern, as coming from an underdeveloped country literally, but also as lacking in education, appropriate manners, and basic courtesy. Indeed, this supposed lack of civility is a good example of how racialized expectations operate. In contemporary Afro-Chinese encounters, blackness, Africanness, and Chineseness are constructed, at least in everyday life conversations, both in relation to each other, but also in relation to an often invisible reference point. This is the West, and ultimately whiteness. Western whiteness, it must be said. Indeed, in Afro-Chinese racializations, there is no Africa-China binary. Afro-Chinese racialization processes are prominently triangular. The need to think in these triangular terms does not only emerge from conducting ethnographic research in Africa or China, but also from conducting historical and archival research. Monson, for instance, intimates that historical actors in Africa-China relations talk about race in triangular, not binary terms. Quote, this is an anecdote from her work, quote, another Tanzanian described feeling astonished when he was invited to sit in the front seat of a vehicle with a Chinese driver. In the colonial period, an African would rarely be invited into the interior of a vehicle. One worker said that the British settlers would even allow their dogs to sit in the front seat of a Land Rover, while the Africans would always have to sit in the back. And the idea that the Chinese man would be the driver and the African the passenger seemed to him like a complete inversion of the colonial relationship. End of quote. Now, this is a fascinating account, but this fascinating account is just one among many ethnographic accounts that detail multiple instances in which the West and whiteness operate as relatively invisible poles of reference. From face-to-face exchanges to geopolitical engagements, real or imagined triangulations with or against the signifier West pervade and crisscross contemporary and historic Afro-Chinese encounters and politics. Accordingly, Monson calls for a historization of difference and race in Africa-China contexts through a triangulation of blackness, Asianness, and whiteness. She draws the notion of triangulation from Claire Jean Kim's 1999 racial triangulation of Asians in the American context. Monson argues that many of the ideas present in racializations of Asian Americans and African Americans resemble the racial thinking present in Afro-Chinese historical engagements. Similar to Monson, Lan, who also draws from Kim, argues that the uneven racialization of blacks in China points to the need to situate anti-black racism in the larger context of triangular power relations between Africa, China, and the West. While both these authors exhort researchers of identity in Africa-China relations to triangulate, neither Monson nor Lan provide a methodological framework or examples regarding triangulation in Africa-China race-related research. But do the logics and dynamics from the American racial context or apply to the case of contemporary Afro-Chinese encounters in Africa and China? Thinking through one of the most recent Africa-China controversies could be useful to answer this question. In 2018, a well-known Chinese actress performed in blackface for a skit titled "The Same Joy, the Same Happiness" on CCTV's Spring Festival Gala. Low naming the woman on the left with exaggerated buttocks, fruit platter, and a black man in a monkey costume played the role of a traditional and somewhat confused African mother in a skit about love, tradition, and China's historical role in Africa. Early media analysis of the incident noted the obvious: the connection between the CCTV's blackface and the long history of this practice in Western popular cultures. A triangular analysis of the incident would be useful not only to historicize this racist archetype or to contextualize its appearance against the background of contemporary racial thinking and racist rhetoric in China, but also to understand how blackness is currently triangulated relative to Asianness and whiteness in a rising Asia. It is worth noting that the appearance of a black face in the skit is not something new to China or the region in general. Reviewing the history of East Asian media and advertising over the last decade yields a long list of black faces. A number of relevant questions emerge at this point. Is the triangulation between Africa, China, and the West the only possible triangulation in this case? Are there other points of reference that could yield new ways of understanding race, racism, and other processes of racialization in Africa-China relations? Leaving the triangulation at the level of Africa and China with the West, or blackness and Chineseness with whiteness, may be problematic, as blackness and Chineseness outside the West were not exclusively co-constituted in relation to whiteness. While very useful, triangulating difference and race exclusively within these points of reference runs the risk of both invisibilizing other points of reference and leaving the West at the center. The critical question here: what weight should be accorded to whiteness and the West in the analysis of the co-constitution of blackness and Chineseness in China-Africa relations? And thinking through Kim's triangulation, what should be the place of whiteness in the field of racial positions that emerges from contemporary cultural and geopolitical Afro-Chinese encounters? Should there be a fixed place for whiteness in Africa-China triangulations? Can other analytical categories enter the triangulation? So also, what does it mean to triangulate in Africa-China race-related research? And more importantly, how could it be performed? As noted earlier, the obvious triangulation is that of Africa and China with the West. But to look at the footprints left by European colonialism as the signifier West in Africa and China when theorizing race and racism is still methodologically and analytically very useful. However, it is crucial to recognize that the West is not anymore and should not be treated as a quintessential part of contemporary racial triangulations. Which brings me to thinking about this black face and trying to triangulate it beyond the racist archetype. So, as an attempt to go beyond the Africa-China-West triad and to provide an answer to the question about the weight of whiteness, I put forward the notion of multiple triangulations to theorize race and racism in Africa-China settings from multiple bearings, points, and or triangles. Thinking in terms of multiple potentially simultaneous triangulations, I contend that beyond the initial triangulation, that of the history of the racist archetype, an analytical triangulation between race, gender, and geopolitics renders a more insightful perspective. Indeed, I argue that beyond the blackface, the gendered nature of the skit, i.e., the damsel in distress trope, and its patronizing Orientalist plot are considerably more problematic than the racist caricature. So, in what follows, I try to triangulate a reading of the geopolitics behind the caricature that draws from the analytical registers of gender, patriarchy, and ethnocentrism. The skit's story was rather simple. Carrie, an 18-year-old Kenyan stewardess, asks her Chinese teacher to pose as her boyfriend to avoid a blind date with a Kenyan man organized by her mother. Carrie does not want to marry yet. She wants to work and then go to China to study. In the skit's resolution, Carrie confesses to her mother and explains her desire to go to China. It becomes clear that Carrie sees China as a way to escape tradition and her mother's traditional views on marriage. The skit intended to highlight the positive aspect of China-Africa relations. It does this, however, by presenting a narrative in which China is seen as a solution to Africa's backwardness. As I was watching the skit, I was reminded of a contestant in the highly popular dating show If You Are the One, Fei Chen-Wu Rao. Similar to the Galas skit, the production of If You Are the One portrayed Xiao De, a participant from Guinea-Bissau, as a free-spirited girl trapped by tradition. Xiao De saw going to China as a way to escape her fate, an arranged marriage, study, and become an independent woman. In the dating show, Xiao De is strictly looking to marry a Chinese man. Moving to China and marrying a Chinese was for Xiao De, as it is for Carrie, a way to escape tradition and enter modernity, a Chinese version of modernity. The blackface skit and Xiao De's portrayal in the dating show reproduce a narrative that encapsulates the way China approaches its relationship with Africa. Both official and popular Chinese narratives about Africa consistently try to construct an image of the continent as China's damsel in distress. The age-old trope of the damsel in distress in film, literature, and video games depicts a young and beautiful woman who needs to be saved from a monster by a male hero. In the end, the woman usually marries her rescuer. On both the skit and the dating show, this gendered narrative portrays China as the modern male hero and Africa as the princess in jeopardy or in a dire predicament caused by tradition. This trope has multiple iterations in contemporary Africa-China relations and is linked to what I call the Chinese savior complex. This savior complex has been portrayed in popular films such as Wu Jing's 2017 box office hit Wolf Warrior 2 and to a lesser extent in Francois' The Wandering Earth, and is associated with what some scholars call Han supremacy. In short, behind the Galas blackface lies a pervasive, consistent, top-down, ego-boosting narrative designed to proffer China as a way for Africa to enter modernity. This narrative not only casts Africa-China relations along the lines of the binary of Africa as the past, China as the future, but perhaps more ironically, it does so through the reproduction of a number of Western stereotypes about both Africa and blackness. The Spring Festival Gala is a program full of skits, While the skits are normally comedic, they generally intend to inform and educate the audience about a particular topic, from military affairs and everyday life to other cultures. The blackface skit, the first in the Gala's history to portray China-Africa relations, succeeds in informing its Chinese audience about China's historical role in Africa. However, in what it fails to do is to educate viewers on the complexities and realities of contemporary sub-Saharan life. The proof is in the pudding. The skit's story is supposedly set in Nairobi, Kenya's capital, but all you can see in the background is a savannah. In the skit, this stereotypical African landscape is about to be crossed by a Chinese-built railway, hailed as part of China's One Belt, One Road initiative. You cannot see it in this image. Representing Africa as the past means associating ideas about Africa strictly with nature and tradition, while China as the future leads to the association of China with modernity and technology. In a way, China represents its role in Africa as a techno-savior that aims to liberate Africa, its damsel, from the shackles of tradition and European colonialism, the monster. Besides the critique of China casting an Orientalist light on Africa, certain scholars wonder about the knowledge production and the types of Chinese and African subjectivities emerging from this seemingly asymmetric relation. This is how CCTV represents Nairobi, and this is an actual image of Nairobi. So indeed, I argue that a multiple triangulations approach is useful here to reveal the production of a field of gendered and racialized positions in contemporary discursive representations of the Afro-Chinese encounter. As a critical methodological tool, multiple triangulations does two things. First, it opens up a space in Africa-China relations for scholars of identity, racism, race, and media representation to start moving their analysis away from the hegemonic binary logics and dichotomies around the ways in which race and racism are and can be discussed. Multiple triangulations suggests that a more nuanced understanding of the specificity of global processes of racialization is gained when dominant Western experiences of racialization and racism lose their default dominance and are treated as reference points rather than paradigms. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it creates a multidimensional space for the triangulation intersection of factors that are often associated with two processes of racialization, i.e. class, gender, religion, nationalism, but not so much accounted for in Africa-China race-related research. Discussions about racism are often as much about nationalism, ethnicity, and race as they are about gender, class, patriarchy, heteronormativity, and other critical issues. Evidently, a wholesale importation of this American model of racial triangulation into Africa-China race-related research would prove insufficient. However, and this is a crucial point that I want to make, as a methodological framework, multiple triangulations can serve as an important prelude to and backdrop for future and more complex, thicker research on race relations in Afro-Chinese settings and beyond. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to appear now in front of you. It's been 50 minutes.
Yes. Thank you very much, Carlos. And if you were in person at the moment, you'd be getting a lot of applause. Thomas, can you let other people in so that they can be on the screen either with video or without video? But could, for the moment, people keep themselves muted? We'll just let them come in now, Roberto. Here we are. Yeah.
I do have to say that what you heard, what I was reading, is maybe around 50% of a full article, right? So there's a lot of things that I was going, jumping quite fast through them. But if anybody has any comments on any of the points that I made, I would be very happy to engage with questions.
Well, that was absolutely fascinating. Both the kind of presentation aspect of it, but also your attempt to theorize out of some, current analyses and impasses and so on. One of the center PhD students, one of my PhD students, who's Chinese, Lin Ma, she had to leave at 2 o'clock, but she's left a question behind, and we may pick that up in due course.
Sure.
Perhaps I could kick off by asking something that occurred to me. I really appreciated where you ended up. The idea of multiple triangulations and so on, I think, has quite a lot of potential. First time I've come across it, by the way, but it seems to me certainly worth thinking about. But on the way, I felt there was something missing, and I was surprised in some ways. And that is that all the authors that you were citing and quoting, they seem to understand race in purely biological terms. Whereas, in the literature today, especially in the Western European literature, perhaps less so in the North American literature, we now regard cultural racism as a very important form of racism. So we talk about racisms in the plural anyway, but cultural racism being something which involves a physical appearance or phenotypical signification, obviously like skin color, but also like, Chinese facial features, eyes and so on, brown skin as well. But what is doing most of the work in the racialization has no reference or very limited reference to biology besides the first level of signification or merely just descriptive identification. So, for instance, and this is the example that's most discussed in Western Europe, Muslims or other people from countries in South Asia or the Middle East may be told that they are culturally inferior or backward, that they're too family-oriented and not sufficiently individualistic, and so on, which of course connects with what you were saying at the end about China as the modernistic, technological savior to a nature traditional Africa. But we understand that as a form of cultural racism, or at least many of us do, certainly I do. But that didn't even get into your analysis as you were presenting it in the racialization process. So though you ended up in a place that actually is very closely paralleled to those of us who talk about cultural racism, but not necessarily multiple triangulations, it was interesting that you got to it while at the same time ignoring the contemporary, and I don't just mean you personally, Roberto, I mean obviously the literature you're referring to, presenting to us. That literature seemed to ignore the contemporary discussion of cultural racism, and therefore found itself having to look for new forms of conceptualization, which of course, is fair enough. But if, as it were, with one hand tied behind its back, because the assumption was that race is only biology, and as that doesn't do enough of the work for the analyses of the empirical cases, therefore we now need to go beyond straightforward racialization.
Yeah. Can I address your comment, Tariq?
Yes, please do. Yes.
Good. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's a fascinating point that you're making here, in the sense that, and I totally agree with you. I think that at some point in this attempt that I'm doing at theorizing race and racism and racialization from a slightly different perspective, at some point I arrived to that. I mean, I'm well aware of the discussions that are taking place, as you say, in different parts of Europe, in the sense that people in Europe mostly, talk more about culture instead of racism, right? But I think I got to that point because at some point in the paper that I was reading, when I start talking about Africa as the past, as you highlighted, right, and China as the techno savior, there is that implication that the relationship goes beyond, as you were saying, beyond the biological racism, and gets more into some kind of cultural or culturally based racial hierarchy, right? Now, I think that, I mean, there are many things that I could try to talk to address your comment, but one thing that I would like to highlight is that theorizations on race and racism in Africa-China relations are still at a very early stage. And for a long time, and I very briefly and superficially reviewed a little bit of the literature, but in many ways, the literature is not only built upon these ideas that race is more of a biological thing, but also is built in a very binary terms, right? So that's why I came up with this idea of a triangulation, because the thing is not only about Africans or Blackness and Chineseness or China, right? And I still believe that, although I'm quite pleased at the moment with this early step in theorizing that I call multiple triangulation, I think that in some ways it's still lacking, for instance, in the sense that the constitution of processes of identity that are associated to culture and race in this day and age go well beyond a triangulation too, right? It's like we could talk perhaps about a relational process, right? And in that sense, one of the criticisms that I've been getting, or one of the comments or concerns that I've been getting from different places where I've presented these ideas, is also related to what extent triangulation fails to encapsulate the complexities. Federica, we heard you sneezing.
Perhaps you could mute yourself,
Yeah,
Federica.
perhaps you could mute yourself. And to what extent triangulation fails to encapsulate the complexities that I'm trying to talk about. And it was suggested to me at some point that perhaps a more complex conceptualization, such as relational racisms, or something more going into assemblages or rhizome, or more technical and more complex theorizations could perhaps encapsulate some of these things that we're talking about. But one of the things that I always say, and with this I'm gonna close my answer, is that in some ways I am trying to still remain at an understandable level, not only for scholars, but also for wider audiences. And in that sense, I think that the triangulation, concept works to try to make things a little bit more complex, but not so complex that people are not interested in them, right? Yeah. But I do take your point about considering more this side of the cultural racisms, as you were talking about.
Yeah. I might come back to that later, but I want to be able to bring other people in at this point. And I'd like to begin with Lynn Ma's question in the Q&A function, because she's had to leave, but she's raised a very good question. So I'll read it out so anyone can, of course, see it, including yourself, Roberto. So she apologized for having to leave early to teach. She really enjoyed the lecture. Thanks a lot for such a well-contextualized scholarship. I'd like to ask if the triangulation is of a necessity in response to the changing place of China integrated in the global picture, or is it a tool for unpacking certain imbalances or something else? Do you get some sense out of that question, and how would you respond to it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that in a way, my scholarship in relation to investigating all these things about race and racism in China-Africa relations definitely is in response to the changing place that China is now occupying, right? First of all, in this global picture that that Lin Ma is talking about, I definitely think that there are a number of imbalances that I call asymmetries in the relationships that China is establishing, not only with Africa, with Latin America, but also with countries like Australia, for instance, and a very complex relationship that now China has with Australia. So I think that this whole thing is to try to understand what is the construction and the constitution of this new imagination or new ideas about China, and how China and the Chinese are thinking of themselves and their place in this global picture. So in that way, I believe that there is it would be very difficult for us to try to make sense of this new place that China is trying to make for itself without looking into triangulations or perhaps more complex forms, as I was talking about earlier, right? To try to make sense of how China is inserting itself in this global picture. And at the same time, I do believe that when we use this idea of triangulations in very specific cases as Africa-China relations, it does work for unpacking certain imbalances that are embedded there. I think that in the next few years, we're going to be talking more and more about this notion of Chinese racial nationalism, and also about this other concept of Han supremacy, right? And I think that these topics are going to become more and more relevant as China becomes even more relevant after all these crises that we're living through.
Thank you. In the chat function, Dennis has asked a short, direct question. So in the scenes that you were talking about, you know, to do with China and perhaps China-Africa, were there any ripples from the Black Lives Matter civil movement in Sino-African relations?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't talk about many of the incidents. I think that in the last year, there's been a number of incidents that are quite relevant to the discussion that I was trying to present to you here. Especially, I don't know, people in the room are aware about what happened in April last year in the context of the coronavirus crisis in China. At some point in Guangzhou, which is one of the biggest cities in southern China, there was what many Africans who lived there saw as a persecution or a profiling of African people in the city. And it was a really massive media event in the sense that a lot of African people, a lot of Black people in the city got evicted, arrested, taken to quarantines forcefully, and so on and so forth. So it was a big moment in the city for African communities, in which when everybody in China in mid-April was thinking that the whole first wave of the coronavirus in China was over, somehow suddenly the Chinese authorities started focusing on Africans in that city, which is the city with the biggest population of Africans. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because the way this got mediatized in the global picture, as Lin Ma was saying, was as one other instance of China proving that Chinese society is an anti-Black society or a racist society, right? And in that sense, and in that context, it got what was happening in Guangzhou, or what happened in Guangzhou over the span of maybe 2 or 3 weeks, got connected to what started happening around April and May in the US very intensely with the Black Lives Matter movement, right? So there was an articulation. I don't know if if it was a ripple, but more of an articulation at some point. At the same time, as I'm based in Hong Kong, so most of you you're into politics and society. So you must be acquainted with the political situation of Hong Kong at the moment. So also there was a connection here in Hong Kong between Black Lives Matter, the fight for democracy in Hong Kong, and what was happening to Africans in the city. So yeah, there's been some connections. However, what is really fascinating to see in China in this day and age in relation to African presence or Black presence in the country is that while there are certain connections in terms of solidarity with other movements like Black Lives Matter, at the same time, there are also very important connections with movements like the alt-right in the US or far-right wing politics in the US and white nationalism that is kind of translated and reinterpreted in China as some kind of Han nationalism or Chinese nationalism and takes aim at migrants, minorities, women, single people, but also foreigners, Indians, brown people, Black people, and so on and so forth. So there are very interesting connections between, you know, different movements on different sides of the spectrum and what happens in China.
Yeah, thank you. Dennis, are you happy with that answer, or did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, thank you very much. Very informative, thanks.
Good, good. Does anyone else have a question at this point? You can ask it on the screen or type it up. Well, while people are thinking and maybe coming with the question in a moment, perhaps I could just follow up what you've said, Roberto. You said that there was a kind of proliferation as a result of the intensification of thinking about racism due to what happened in April, and also, you know, the Black Lives Matter global profile. You said there was a kind of borrowing from the American right as well, or identifying with it and turning it into anti-migrant sentiment targeted at different kinds of migrants. So you said Indians, for instance, and you know, you listed a number. So my question is, was this expressed, this sentiment expressed in a generic anti-migrant way, or as it were, it also had a kind of multiple racisms character? And if so, was it more like what we understand as cultural racisms?
Well, I think, I mean, from what I've been observing in the last few months, I think that both implications are connected in the case in China. Maybe 1 or 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago, 2018, almost 3 years ago, there was a change in the law for citizenship in China, and it made it easier for non-Chinese and other types of foreigners to become citizens of the country, at least on paper. And there was a huge backlash after that in terms of all these people that were taking aim at how non-Chinese people and other foreigners should not be allowed to become Chinese, because for anyone to become Chinese, it's only for people who belong to the 54 or 55 ethnic groups of China, and especially focusing on the majority, right? So that was happening as like a little bit as an anti-immigrant, if we could say it like that, although those words are not really used in China as such. And at the same time, there was a wider aim at, there is definitely in the discourses that we can identify now on Chinese social media and the Chinese internet, all these extreme right-wing, nativist, localist movements that are taking aim at a variety of minorities, from gender minorities to migrants to any kind of difference that pretends to exist outside the rigid box of, you know, patriarchal ethno-nationalism. So they take aim at that. So in that sense, I think what's going on in China, which is really fascinating, and it's also not my field of expertise, but I'm obviously familiar with what's going on in relation to that, is that it's quite interesting to see how this right-wing nationalism has been taking place in China now.
And does it follow through then, for instance, the most prominent visible case that everyone's talking about at the moment is the Chinese government's treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province.
Yeah.
But,
yeah.
you know, there's also the case of Tibet and so on. Does what's happening there, can that be analyzed in terms of the concepts like racism or racialization process or cultural racism or triangulation of racism, you know, your own way of talking, or multiple, and so on? Does that have, do these concepts have traction on that internal phenomenon, which of course is nothing to do with migrants?
No, I think all these things could be used to analyze what's going on in there. Whatever is going on in there, because you must know that whatever is going on in there is quite contentious, right? There's so many different people saying or having different versions as to what is going on in there. But definitely, I think that all these discussions, or all these theoretical tools, if you want, could be used to analyze, you know, to also be brought into what happens in China at the internal domestic level. One of the things that I've been trying to do, which I don't talk about this in this paper, but I did in a number of articles that I published over the last few years, is that if we start thinking away from this obstacle of methodological nationalism, right? And when we think about migration and mobility, we break away with methodological nationalism and start thinking about foreigners in China in specific as if they were ethnic minorities of China too, right? I'm simplifying the argument that I made some years ago, but the point that I was trying to make is that Africans in particular, or Black people, although obviously they're not one single group or one single ethnic group, in China they're understood and framed by media and the government as one single group, Blacks or Africans, right? And in that sense, especially in the urban centers where you find a huge number of them, they are treated as if they all belong to the same group, like an ethnic minority, if you want, right, in the country. And in a very fascinating way, they're treated by the authorities at the street level, but also at the institutional level, in very similar ways as they would treat certain ethnicities in China that are at the margins. I'm talking about Muslims in China, which are mainly coming from two ethnicities. One is Uyghur, which is the one you're talking about, and the other one is Hui Chinese, which is a Han Muslim group, but it's a different ethnic group. So Africans and Uyghurs and Hui, at least at the urban level, but also at the institutional level before the last few years, were treated in very similar ways, right? Excluded, persecuted, harassed, and so on and so forth. Now, the Uyghur thing became a little bit more complex and is definitely another topic. But the point that I was trying to make in that is that if we go away from these blinders of methodological nationalism, and we start thinking about different groups within China as if they were, you know, similar, rather than foreigners versus locals, then we find that Africans have inserted themselves somehow accidentally within the whole complexity of the Chinese trans-ethnic system, and they are treated as if they were a local group. And maybe that's what a lot of people don't like, because China has a history of not being very, very kind to the ethnic minorities that lie at the margins of Chineseness, right? And I think that, yeah, I mean, this could be a very fascinating discussion.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you for opening it up for us. We have come more or less to the end of our time.
Yeah.
But if someone did have a final question that they haven't been able to put so far, speak now or forever hold your peace.
Can I add to my question?
Yes, go ahead, Dennis.
In the context of the Chinese Revolution, you remember in history when tens of millions of people were dying. Probably this issue of the multi-ethnic minority rights is kind of really small if you compare it to the rest of the population. How does that even exist? It's quite disproportionate in terms of population size. I imagine that the international diaspora in China is much smaller than the rest of the population.
Yeah, Dennis, thank you very much. One of the things that I normally tell my students, because I often teach courses on Africa-China relations, is that I've always been fascinated by the amount of attention that African presence in China generates compared to the actual size of Africans in the country. And also, as you're maybe pointing out, compared to the relevance that population and any other foreign diasporic population has in China, right? We're talking about very, for China's size, we're talking about very small numbers, right? Still, I think that it's normally been blown up by researchers, by media, and whenever there's an incident that gets mediatized. I mean, we now live in such a complex environment with social media that whenever something happens, although it may be affecting perhaps a dozen people in China, it gets mediatized and it gets brought into, for instance, the Black Lives Matter mediascapes and discussions, and it gets sort of translated into certain anxieties and debates that take place in the West, and then they blow it out of proportion, and it looks like this is something that people are living through in China and is really affecting their lives, while perhaps it's not as big, or many people in China have no idea whatsoever about what's happening. For instance, and with this I'm going to finish, the example that I showed in the abridged version of the paper that I read for you about the blackface. This is 2018, right? And at least in my circles or in my networks, this was like a massive storm, like a typhoon, right? Like everybody was all the time talking outrage, scandal, and everything, right? But this year, a couple of weeks ago, there was another blackface in the same TV show in China, the China CCTV Gala, which is the Chinese New Year show, and it happened again, and people were like, again saying, how could this be? How could this happen again after all the controversies and the scandal that happened before? And this is because all these things are not relevant for the Chinese population and for people in China. Most people in China didn't even know what happened 2 or 3 years ago. And if you go and Google it now, just Google blackface China, and you will see that there's so many results from like all the international media, BBC, CNN, the first pages of so many different newspapers talking about that in 2018. But in China, people were not, not aware. And I'm not talking about the fact that in China, information doesn't really flow. A lot of information flows in China. It's just that this is not relevant to a lot of people that live there, right?
Yes, thank you very much. I think this has been a really fascinating presentation and seminar for us. I've learned a lot, and I can see that all kinds of bridges can be, and indeed should be, built in what we might call cross-national comparative racisms. So who knows? We may be in touch. We may be in touch more. So thank you very much again, Roberto. Thank you to everyone else. Our next presentation is